We begin with the ultimatum issued by Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. He's threatening to hold up House business with just 7 days remaining before Parliament rises for winter break.
We are going to put in thousands of amendments at committee and in the House of Commons, forcing all-night, round-the-clock voting to block your $20 billion of inflationary spending and the rest of your economically destructive plans until you agree to our demand to take the tax off farmers, First Nations, and families.
Now, we asked to speak to the opposition House Leader Andrew Scheer or any member of the Conservative caucus, but no one was made available. But for the government's response, I'm joined by Government House Leader Karina Gould. Karina Gould, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, David.
Okay, so the Conservatives say they're going to carry out obstruction tactics in the House, at committee, unless you move on lifting the carbon tax for farmers, families, and First Nations. What's your response to this?
Well, they're being absolutely ridiculous and they're being totally disingenuous with Canadians. First of all, when they talk about the price on pollution, I mean, this is not the silver bullet that is going to lift the high cost of living. In fact, there was a really important CBC article that came out yesterday done by Trevor Toome, a Calgary-based economist, that showed that the vast majority of Canadians get more back in the price on pollution rebate than they contribute to it. In fact, he said 94%, I believe, of those with incomes of $50,000 a year or less. So what they're talking about is actually taking money away from Canadians. And then when they talk about removing the price on pollution for farmers, 97% of fuels that farmers use already are exempt from the price on pollution. And all he is doing is trying to hold up important legislation that would help Canadians. He's talking about holding up legislation that would build more purpose-built rental units, that would create more competition in the grocery sector, that would set Canada's economy up for success into the future, and of course the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. He is dead set against having any of these measures put in place to actually help Canadians, Canadian families, Canadian farmers. And so what he is doing is irresponsible, it's reckless, and quite frankly, it's not being truthful with Canadians, and it's not leadership.
I know the CBC article you mentioned. Trevor Toome provided some of the analysis in it. The piece was written by Robson Fletcher, though. I want to give my colleague credit for his good work there. But look, I know you don't like what Pierre Poilievre is doing, but they seem intent on doing it. And you do have these critical pieces of legislation that you want to get through. So I'm assuming the government is not going to capitulate to the demands to strip carbon price. Yeah, I know. So where does this leave us in terms of Parliament getting its work done and being able to shut down on the 15th as it's
Look,
scheduled?
Parliament will get its work done. This is one leader of one political party. He's not the only political party in the House. He's the only one that leads a party that is ideologically against fighting climate change at all costs, apparently. And he there's three other parties in the House that support fighting climate change, that support helping Canadian families, right? Remember, his party has voted against measures like the Canada Child Benefit, lowering the age of old age security, access from 67 to 65, the Canada Dental Benefit, and I could go on and on and on. But what do you do with a bully? You stand up to them. And Mr. Poilievre is trying his bullying tactics in Parliament, just like he directed his Conservative senators to do with independent senators in the Senate. And so we are going to stand up against him and continue to stand for Canadians, not against them. And I have to just say this, David, I think he is really taking Canadians for granted right now. He is assuming that they aren't as intelligent as they are. They aren't as committed as they are to making sure that there is a future for them and for their children, where there's clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. And I have to say that Canadians should be exceptionally disappointed with his silly partisan games that he is playing. Have
you spoken with the Bloc Québécois House Leader, the NDP House Leader, to work together to push through whatever the Conservatives are going to do here? Because as you said, this is the only party on this particular policy path. Can you count on the cooperation of the other parties to get your legislative agenda through Parliament?
Yeah, I think so. Look, I mean, when it comes to these other pieces of legislation, they have voted in favor of them already. It is only the Conservatives that are playing these obstructive games. I have to say, every other party, Liberals, NDP, Bloc, Greens, we all have respect for Canada's democratic institutions and respect, most importantly, for Canadians. And what he is doing is disrespectful not just to our democratic institutions, but it's disrespectful to Canadians. And quite frankly, he should be ashamed of what he's doing.
We are going to put in thousands of amendments at committee and in the House of Commons, forcing all-night, round-the-clock voting until you agree to our demand to take the tax off farmers, First Nations, and families.
He can, make us work late. We're happy to do it because we're doing important things for Canadians while he's pulling stunts.
There are two bloc parties in this House of Commons. There's the Bloc Québécois and there's the Bloc Everything Party, and the Bloc Everything Party is the Conservative Party of Canada.
Okay, all of this move comes after senators narrowly voted to amend a bill that would carve out some farm heating fuels from the carbon tax, at least for grain drying, and that could see the bill sent back to the House. This all led to a rowdy question period and a Conservative MP being kicked out of the House.
Prime Minister lied and his minions continue to lie about
Order! The honourable member who got here at the same time I did knows full well that you can't use that word. The honourable member of Battle River Crowfoot, will you be retracting that?
It's the truth. It's the truth. I will not apologize to the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Couric, would you mind leaving us today?
All right, so how will Canadians see this fight over carbon tax in the temple of our democracy? It's time to bring in the power panel. Amanda Alvaro is a political commentator. Tim Powers is the chair of Summa Strategies. And here with me in the studio, Jordan Leiknitz is the Canada Program Manager for the Frederick Ebert Foundation, and Sherelle Evelyn is the Managing Editor of the Hill Times. Sherelle, I want to start with you. What the heck is happening in the House of Commons right now? The Liberals are not going to cancel the carbon tax on everything. The Bloc doesn't support it. The NDP doesn't support it. The Conservatives can't get this. Like, what do you make of where we are?
I mean, we've been seeing for weeks, if not months, if not years. It's just evolved into playground bullying, name calling. You add the social media on top of that. I mean, we saw the Conservative MP get kicked out of the House today. As soon as it happened, I was watching Question Period today, as one does, and as soon as it happened, I said, okay, within 5 minutes, this is going to be on social media.
And bingo.
And it was, yeah. And they're going to be using it for, fundraising and all the other things, which another Conservative MP did the last time they got kicked out. There's no real... They will play to the base. The base will love it. The base will eat it up. Everybody else is just going to get turned off and turned away, and that is the best time for politicians to carry on with these shenanigans when nobody is paying attention. When people just start to tune them out because they say, people in this room, in this place, in this temple of democracy, as you called it, which I know you were kidding, to a degree.
In theory, I mean, it's supposed to be, right?
Yeah, but nobody's treating it as, a sacred space. They're treating it as a place where they can go and throw tantrums and basically get away with it because they know that ultimately people don't care. They've been doing this long enough that they've soured people on, the theatrics of especially Question Period, so that when the actual work is getting done, nobody's watching.
Okay, I was looking at my computer while you were talking, not because I wasn't listening to you, because I needed to double check something that I was just told. And Jordan, I'm going to get your reaction to this if I can. This speaks to what's happening in Ottawa right now. So Ken Hardy, who is in some hot water for his tweet last week that we talked about, he has tweeted about Pierre Poilievre saying, why doesn't he just stamp his little feet and hold his breath, especially the hold his breath part. That is, instead of tabling over 20,000 amendments to one piece of legislation, referring to the filibuster, basically hold your breath and stop talking. Rachel Thomas has now objected to this, saying the tweet insinuates that the leader of the official opposition should commit suicide by holding his breath.
Well, I think we've officially reached peak silly season. That's probably what this is most indicative of. I mean, look, I think it's really clear that what's driving a lot of the worst behavior that we've seen out of the Conservatives over the last few weeks is the desire for clips for social media. I think some of this stuff is no exception. And really, I think for better or for worse, Sherelle is absolutely right. Most Canadians are not going to notice or care about what's happening. This is for a very narrow audience. It's to rile up the Conservative base, I think, in a lot of ways. This is appealing to them. And on the other hand, are they actually going to make the government sit through Christmas? No, they're not. They'll come to a deal. Everybody will go home a few days early, as is what usually happens. So I think this is all pretty predictable, and what it really mostly has the net effect of is turning people off politics, unfortunately. It's really reinforcing the idea that this is an unpleasant business with unpleasant people.
Amanda, isn't that part of the strategy, though, to win? That the Conservative base is motivated and shows up reliably. It's low turnout for the other parties that really hands them an advantage.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has handed them an advantage, but I think that they're pushing really hard into territory that has the opportunity to really turn people off, as others have suggested on the panel. I mean, it's obstruction, it's derailing Parliament, it's taking away from important debate that needs to happen. And while I agree that people are at home watching every motion and checking on all the amendments and really like checking the box on how many hours have been devoted to debate, I do think that they're tuning in to the clips that turn up on their television sets. And it was interesting. I was on a podcast a couple of weeks ago with a 10-year-old, and she was asking us questions. And she said her first question was, why do politicians have to be so mean? And I thought, you know, it was illuminating, because that is the overall message, that we can't get things done, that we are mired in these problems, that there is a lot of bullying. And when people are really feeling their at-home pressures, and we've talked about them a lot, the affordability pressures and other issues as we're heading into the holidays, the last thing people want to look at on their television screens is a bunch of adults screaming at each other and threatening to hold up Parliament to get the job done. So I do think that the Conservatives sometimes, like, while they use these tactics to get the headline, they may have pushed this one just a little too far.
But, you know, Tim, there's the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. There's the measures on grocery competition and various, rental housing. These are things the Liberals need to get through. It seems like the Bloc and the New Democrats may help them do it, to push it through in time to get on the calendar. I don't know. But, you know, is there a consequence to be had for being an obstructionist on this, if it really is just about the carbon tax?
I don't think so, and I think that's what the Conservatives have calculated. I mean, we can step back to different eras, and there have always been theatrics, particularly around this time of year. Go back in the days when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister, David, and, you know, the Rat Pack, of which one of those members became the Premier of Newfoundland and a senior minister, Brian Tobin, in the day. So there's always been this. I think Amanda makes a good point, though, that the Conservatives do have to be mindful of. In this era, and rightly so, you have to watch between the theatrics and actually moving to a place where you are or can be accused of bullying. Then you're in a bit more of a different place. And for Poilievre, who is doing very well among female voters who are particularly attuned to issues around bullying, that's something you'll want to pay attention to. But by and large, look, I flew down here today, David, and not one person on the plane, shockingly, was talking about the theatrics in the House of Commons. What this reminds me of is the hockey game I was at last week between the Florida Panthers and the Ottawa Senators, and you'll remember this one. Fights all night, fights all night. Finally, the referee, when he had enough, he gave everybody a game misconduct. Yeah. Unfortunately, Greg Fergus can't do that because he's in his own hot water right now. The last point I'd make about all of this, for Poilievre and the Conservatives, I think what they're hoping will happen too is, beyond the noise of the hijinks and the back and forth and all of that, they'll be able to drive a message to people who are out now holiday shopping, who are going to the grocery store, who are paying for gas and things are tough. And if they hear anything from the mainstream media clips, what I think the Conservatives hope they hear is somebody's trying to get you some relief. So that's a bit of the calculus as well.
But, you know, Cheryl, Tim talked about the risk of being seen to slip into bullying, and that's what happened in the Senate, right? I mean, the Speaker of the Senate found that Conservative leader in the Senate and other Conservative senators, their attempts to intimidate independent senators on that carbon tax legislation 234 was a breach of their privilege, and it went beyond. So they're trying to like gum things up in the House and bully things through in the Senate, and it's not really making anybody happy, it seems.
No, it's not making anybody happy. It's worse than not making people happy. It's making people unsafe, and I think that is where that's kind of like a microcosm of what we're seeing throughout the rest of society. It's like, yes, there are words that people use, and in this case, it did cross over a little bit into more than words. Senator Plett, he did admit to getting up, going over to these senators, and basically yelling in their faces. But that expands to we see in social media, we see in all these other platforms where it starts with words and then it turns into actions. And the more people see our political leaders engaging in this sort of behavior and then just kind of brushing it off, we're all just here to do our jobs, and so you got some hate mail, suck it up. Like, that doesn't
there's no sympathy for the senators, I found, from the Conservatives. They're like, the poor senators, it's like someone had to leave their house because security and the cops told them it wasn't safe. Right?
Exactly. And you cannot now say that is acceptable, and then at the other hand have Conservative MPs like Rachel Thomas saying what she's saying, and thinking that that's going to be okay, that people won't emulate this. They're big on personal responsibility, especially on the Conservative side of the House, but they don't ever quite seem to make that connection that other people are listening and acting on their words.
Yeah, the verbatim I've just been sent by the helpful people in the newsroom. It insinuates that the leader of the official opposition should commit suicide, and so I'd like to give him, being Ken Hardy, the opportunity to apologize for that statement and to retract it. I have no idea if Ken Hardy apologized. I get the feeling they may not take that as seriously as Rachel Thomas does. But Jordan, at the heart of all of this is a fight over the carbon tax, and it's important to talk about the facts on the carbon tax. And my colleague Robson Fletcher did a piece out of CBC Calgary, quotes a lot of analysis by Trevor Toome, who's a very credible, well-known economist at the University of Calgary. Unless you are a household of more than $250,000 in annual income, you get more from the carbon rebate than you pay in the carbon tax. And from the Bank of Canada on down, it's been made very clear that a lot of the food price, the carbon tax is a very, very small part of inflation because these same cost pressures are in jurisdictions that have no carbon price. So how does the government get that message out? Does it need to get that message out? Because it feels like Canadians need to know what they're making a decision on, and a lot of them don't know.
Yeah, well, I think the Liberals need a time machine on that one, regrettably. They needed to get the message out on that years ago. They needed to build it into the rollout of the program. Most Canadians who receive their rebates for the carbon tax have no idea what it is. It doesn't come to them labeled in any way or in any way that they would connect it with the carbon tax, and inherently a system in which you're taxed and then reimbursed, even if the reimbursement is marginally more than what you're taxed, it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. And there wasn't a great deal of effort put into communicating that early on. And so it was really ripe for the Conservatives to take that and turn it into the Axe the Tax campaign that they so successfully have. Look, every empirical analysis shows exactly what you say, which is why it's such an interesting question about what the Conservatives hypothetically would do about the rebates were they to get into power and axe the tax, because this is a fairly substantial amount of money for a lot of Canadians. And I think you'd have an interesting conversation if they were to start talking about clawing that back. But no, there's no question. The Liberals have a massive communications problem on this, and my view is that it's actually too late for them to correct it.
Amanda, I always remember my grandmother talking about getting the baby bonus from Joey Smallwood because it came every month, and it was the baby bonus, and that's why she voted for him right up until the early 70s when everyone threw him out. But there's none of that with the climate incentive, whatever it's called, that shows up every quarter. It feels like, if you want to make it more politically successful, it should be monthly and labeled and this sort of a thing rather than the way it is being handled, because they have a problem on their hands with how people feel about this.
Yes, you're totally right. And you mentioned the baby bonus, and any of us who are old enough to remember how significant that was. And part of it was like the labeling of it, the baby bonus, the bonus. The words rebate kind of flies over the head of a lot of people as well. I agree with a lot of what Jordan said, which is, difficult as sort of the Liberal member on this panel, because the communication strategy of the government has been really, really challenging on this one. Does it mean that they can't turn it around? I don't know, not necessarily. I think that it would require a significant effort in terms of investment. The branding on this has really gone to the Conservatives. The Conservatives have been able to brand it as a tax. They have really been able to brand it, we don't talk about it as carbon pricing. We talk about it as the carbon tax. It's part of our vernacular now. And I think that, that in and of itself is a challenge. When you ask, the average person, do they think that they're paying a carbon tax, or do they think that they're somehow getting money feedback for the same thing, I think it's very difficult for people to really rip those two apart and understand if there's any connective tissue at all. So a rebranding effort, a significant, consistent communication strategy on this one over and over again would be job one. But is it too little, too late? Perhaps.
So Tim, just to come back to your flight home, and nobody was talking about the antics of what's happening here in the House of Commons, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter, you know? And that's what I wonder about. Like, where does this go? Because the threat made today, and we'll see where it goes, but that feels like that kind of Republican-level obstructionism we've seen in Congress at various points in the United States, like the full sort of shutdown of the legislative agenda. Like, it seems to go a little bit beyond filibustering, trying to jam people into Christmas. It'll affect, you know, all the staff and people who work there. And you stick that on top of the privilege finding over the way conservative senators treated independent senators. There is something here that is a bit off.
Well, first of all, I think we have to put some Newfoundland context on things. When David Cochrane was born, Joey Smallwood delivered 2 gold bars to the Cochrane family. That was the bonus that David was to Newfoundland and Labrador from my fellow panelists.
My grandfather just trusted Smallwood so much he founded a union. But anyway, go ahead.
Now to the more serious nature of David's question. Yes, yes, to the point that, you know, that there is a danger here of this going too far and trends in the South kicking in here. But I think that is being accepted because there is so much frustration in the land right now. And the responsibility then does fall to both the Conservatives and the Liberals to try and manage that anger and displacement that people feel out there, but neither is really doing that super well. I think the Conservatives feel, I don't think they're entirely wrong on this, that they have a bit of rope to move here because people are so very much irritated. I think people are less concerned about parliamentary decorum and language and antics that go on there than they are about their own pocketbook at the moment. So in other times and in other places, and our audience aside, look, this audience, to be fair to this audience, they care a lot about this issue, and God bless them for doing that, but that isn't broad spread across the country. And I think other people are prepared to, you know, let a little bit of the rabble-rousing, rowdy behavior on the edge of going too far go if there's a benefit to them in the end. And I think that's what Poilievre is trying to push. But it is playing a little bit, can be playing with a fire if you're not careful.
But, you know, Sherelle, there's about a week left, in theory, before Parliament rises for the break. And essentially what the Conservatives are asking the government to do is reverse a core policy they've been elected on 3 times and which is supported by every party in the House of Commons except the Conservatives. It seems like a tough ransom demand.
Simple. What am I going to mean? Yeah, that's why we know it's not going to go anywhere. That's why it's, and you know, to Tim's point, talking about this being something that's bubbling up from the South, I don't even know if I would say that. I think it's very much baked into the Canadian system. We've seen it multiple times since, at the very least, since Trudeau's been Prime Minister, where the Conservatives have, you know, said we're going to have you here and we're going to vote all night. There have been numerous marathon votes. But I don't think, and it hasn't changed the channel yet. They have yet to, you know, make the government do what it is that they say that they're going to do, and they have yet to actually follow through. If they want to, you know, surprise us and say this time we're actually going to do what we say we're going to do, and nobody's going home in whatever way they can do that, I don't know if it's actually procedurally possible to go past the December 15th. Then I'm happy to be surprised. Well, I would say happy, but I would be surprised and interested to see how that actually plays out because it hasn't happened before.
Yeah, Jordan, just as a final point, though, it seems like there's this larger political narrative of kind of dysfunction happening in the country, right? With certain provinces saying we're not going to collect federal taxes. Essentially, the opposition and some premiers saying this government has no authority to govern.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And look, confrontation and conflict is built into our political system. Just look at the mother parliament in Britain, right? So this is something that you're never going to get away from. But I think where it reaches a dangerous place and a toxic place is where when you don't get the political win using the tools that are legitimate inside the system, that you try to block or overturn things, in ways that are against the rules, in ways that delegitimize the system.
Right.
And that's what you're seeing from some of those premiers like Scott Moe, for example. And I think that that's really where the Conservatives risk overstepping the line here. There's no issue, if, as Tim says, they're operating within the rules and they're going to capture people's interest for working on their behalf, for, if people think that about the carbon tax. But at a certain point, this also could impact his likability, and Canadians may not want to vote for an arsonist.
Well, none of this has hurt him so far. I mean, I got to say, you got to look at his numbers. The man knows how to tap into a zeitgeist and mobilize money and volunteers, that's for sure. Okay, I want to thank the Power Panel, Sherelle Evelyn, Jordan Lakenitz, Tim Powers, and Amanda Alvaro. Thanks, gang.